Ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and bring in our next speaker on board, Kevin Fullbrook. Kevin is Deputy Director at Al Bayan Bilingual School in Kuwait. He has a Masters of Business Administration focused in organizational leadership from Southern Cross University, an experienced educational leader with a demonstrated history of achieving outstanding outcomes for school communities around the world, skilled in coaching, statistical data analysis, educational technology, and instructional design. Let's go ahead and welcome Kevin on board.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone, and welcome from Kuwait City. So great to have you with me today as we look to discuss anti-fragile schools and how we build strong, resilient organizations that thrive on change. A little bit about what we're going to discuss today. We're going to be looking at the why. Why is this important? What is it all about? How do we actually achieve thriving, resilient, robust, anti-fragile schools? And then also discuss what if it works, what if it doesn't, what are the possibilities? It's such an interesting and vast topic. It could well raise more questions than it answers. And really the purpose of this session over the next 20 minutes, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, is to take one thing away from this session, just one thing that resonates with you, that you find interesting enough to take back to your colleagues, your peers, your organization, and say, look, this is something that's worth looking into further and exploring a bit more. So let's dive right in. We don't have much time. What is anti-fragility? Really, it's about an organization or a framework or a thing that loves randomness and uncertainty. It really thrives on it. It's really a necessary element of complex systems. And we'll talk about what complex systems are, what their characteristics and what their strengths are, and how we can thrive in those types of systems. It describes a system that really, where stresses, shocks, and mistakes are necessary for growth. They're not perceived as negatives. They're actually required. They're not something to endure. They're actually required and necessary for growth to occur in individuals and organizations. And it's beyond robustness. It's not enough to be robust and resilient. That is a part of it, and perhaps it's a precursor to being anti-fragile, but it's certainly not enough. Now, if you haven't read this book already from Nassim Taleb, I highly recommend getting stuck into it. Anti-fragile, things that gain from disorder. It really talks about not related specifically necessarily to schools or education, although he gives some examples as it relates to that, but really to any systems and organizations that can be described by this framework. He talks about some things that thrive when they're exposed to volatility, randomness, and disorder, things that typically we would try to avoid or minimize. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really beyond, looking beyond resilience or robustness, and not just resisting shocks, but using them to get better and to improve. And, you know, he describes a trend where we've been fragilizing our economy, our systems, everything around us to try and resist stresses and change. And you know, he argues, and I would argue that perhaps that is not the best way to set ourselves up for success in a rapidly changing world. I think, as we have all witnessed and experienced in this past year of great adaptability and change and flexibility that has been required of us, especially in schools and those of us who work within school systems and with students. So how do we get it? How do we get to this point where we can build up and move beyond a sense of resilience and robustness in our schools or systems? So one of the first steps is recognizing where complex systems exist. What is a simple system versus what is a complicated system versus what is a complex system? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. It's really about not doing anything in isolation. Complex systems are really a diverse, interconnected web of people and things that change and respond to each other in real time. And the only way that we can create really anti-fragile systems is by co-creating them with others that are a part of the same system. One way to do that is to use design thinking approaches that embrace really testing and failing and iterating and improving each time. And we'll talk a little bit more about design thinking in a minute as well. So, as many of us who work in schools have found over the past 18 months or so, that, you know, we've been undergoing a range of scenario planning to deal with things as they evolve and change. And that can be really exhausting. People are fatigued by that, you know, and that is one view of how we deal with the challenges that confront us. Is, do we plan for 38 different scenarios that can occur, and then when one of them happens, we pull that plan out of the drawer and try and enact it? Or do we create a system that is prepared to respond to any of those different scenarios, that the underlying frameworks and systems that we set up thrive on those changes? So we can certainly do that through co-creation, working with people. And it really has, if we are talking about how we move through this process, co-creation exists in a system that needs to be flexible and adaptable and learned. And it's really focused on how people work together, not necessarily the work product or the end product, although that is very, very important, but often overlooked is how the people work together in pursuit of a solution. And it's building together step by step. Those of you familiar with design thinking processes is about that iterative improvement at each step, prototyping and testing and improving. But doing that together as a team is just so vital. And it's important to have the tools and frameworks to know when to think and when to act and everything in between. I think we've all experienced times where either in groups or in partnerships where we get bogged down in the talking and there doesn't seem to be any action. And other times we move to the other end of the scale too quickly. We move too quickly to action and solutions when we haven't taken enough time to really plan and consider the actual problem that we're trying to solve. Now, as we create things, there's a kind of a continuum of how we can think about it. At very one end of the continuum is simply, as an individual or a group, you would create something and then you give it to someone else for some feedback and say, well, look, I finished this. I think it's pretty good. I'd like your feedback. And then maybe you do or don't do something with that feedback that you get. As we move through the continuum of that, going from feedback to consultation, we actually speak with people during the process of creation. Moving further along, it's actually about engaging with those people and having them involved in a more robust way. If we continue on some more, it's about collaboration. We're working alongside them. We're not asking them, we're not creating something and asking for their feedback to then improve. We're involving them much more closely in that collaboration, and then finally through to co-creation. And typically in schools or lots of organizations, the conversations between key groups are generally disconnected. So between staff and students, staff and parents and so forth. But really they need to be in the same room together, designing these solutions that will be anti-fragile, that will bend and sway and improve with any type of scenario that might unfold. We talked before a little bit about design thinking as one of the methods, the processes that we can follow. And really it is a process for creative problem solving. What is often overlooked is that it's really has people at the core. It's a human-centered process. And it's really focused on the people that you're creating for the users at the end, whether that's parents or students or whatever it might be. And by doing that leads to a better product if you have those people in mind through the process that you follow. Now, there's many different types of visual representations of design thinking. I like this one because it kind of describes an endless loop of iteration and improvement. I would highlight in the top left-hand corner there, empathizing as the first stage, really understanding clearly the problem that you're trying to solve. Quite often we skip past that and we want to be solution focused. We can't focus on a solution until we know exactly the problem that we're trying to address and come up with a solution for. So why do we do all this? What's the point? Well, to start with, you get better outcomes for students, the end users of these processes, by involving people, by iterating, by developing systems that can deal with a range of different scenarios and outcomes. Surely that's got to be better for our students. You can create closer links with our community. You get additional buy-in from those groups. As you increase your networks and include people in these things, you'd be surprised the doors that are open to funding, expertise, and other resources. And for those of you who work in international education or schools, that sometimes with schools with turnover as staff move through a range of international schools, quite often it's the families, parents, and students that are the most lasting aspect of a school, with the institutional knowledge and culture and history. And if you're not including those people in these processes, then you're missing out on a really vital and important aspect of this. So earlier we talked about, at the beginning, we talked about that a sense of the anti-fragile as it relates to complex systems. Now, what is a complex system? And I've used this analogy here, that the difference between a complicated system and a complex system, and recognizing the difference between these two. So in a complicated system, for example, is a bit like sending a rocket to the moon. So you need clear formula, high levels of expertise. But once you've solved the problem once, even though it could be really tricky, the problem remains solved. And it's really easy to replicate over and over again because you have solved the problem and it remains solved. So let's compare that to a complex problem. I've got there raising a child. Not that raising a child is a problem, but bear with me for a moment. So formula have limited application at all. For those of you who haven't, I have 2 children. What might work for one child has absolutely no application, does not work in any way for my second child. It gives you experience, but it doesn't mean that each future you'll be any more successful with, in terms of raising your children. Each child is unique and must be approached individually, and there's still a whole lot of uncertainty in that. And that's really, we're talking about a complex system in that way, as opposed to a complicated system. So let's try and give a bit more of another example. If we take a problem to be solved, so a problem to be solved, for example, here is 2 intersecting roads and maximizing the flow of traffic through 2 intersecting roads. So you have one solution on the left, which is traffic lights, solution on the right, a roundabout. Now, this is 2 different responses to a complex problem. On the left-hand side, the traffic lights. Traffic lights have set rules and procedures, very little individual thought or decision-making required, little judgment required. Red is stop, green is go, that's it. For a roundabout, it's very different. It's basically a general guideline, and it just says, really, give way to anyone who's already in the roundabout. Other than that, you'll work it out. And it puts the onus back on people to use independent thought, the use of judgment, experience, decision-making, etc. Now, research shows all the time roundabouts are safer increased traffic flow, which is kind of counterintuitive. You would assume that would be the case for traffic lights, removing decision-making, making things very clear, but that is not the case. And when we think about this, do we think, well, how do I approach some of these types of challenges as they relate to complex systems? So a school is a complex system, a family is a complex system. Anything that involves people really is a complex system. How do we approach these types of challenges in our schools or organizations? Do we put in traffic lights? Do we put in these rigid, fragile systems that are easily broken, or when something changes, they just don't change or are flexible or adapt with it? Or do we install roundabouts? Does it allow enough scope and maneuverability for people to use their independent judgment, thought, and experience to deal with changing circumstances? A more anti-fragile approach. Another excellent book, if you haven't read it already, it talks about complex systems, and it talks about, Todd Rose in The End of Average talks about a web of development. So having a success criteria at the end, having a clear definition of what your final destination is, but recognizing there are many different ways to get there. Another excellent book by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Now, it's not too much about American history or past US presidents, but it's about diversity of teams. And when you're developing, when you're co-creating these solutions for your individual organizations, it really matters who you involve. Is it just people that you like and get along with and are agreeable? Or it's people who are going to challenge you and offer a different opinion, perspective, or viewpoint? Now, of course, there's some challenges with this approach, and it can be confronting and challenging for staff that are, depending on the organization, that are used to having really clear, unambiguous sets of rules and do this, don't do this type of frameworks. It can be really challenging culturally to address that. It's really important, those situations you set clear guidelines and ways of working. This is how we're going to approach developing solutions for this complex challenge or thing that we have. Capping expectations, starting small. You can't, you don't want to bite off more than you can chew initially. Embracing disagreement. Quite often in groups, we want to avoid it at all costs. We need to do the opposite, embracing the disagreement, diversity of views and opinions. So what if things go wrong? Well, we need to be open to new ideas and suggestions as we develop these new solutions. And just because we disagree with it doesn't mean it's wrong. The idea of an idea meritocracy. So an idea proposed by the CEO or someone in a position of authority or leadership doesn't necessarily mean it's a better idea than someone else's has been proposed. Putting ideas on the table and selecting the best ones is really important. Use open-ended probing questions to get the most out of people and develop more robust and authentic solutions. So, in summary, it's really, really important to be intentional. This doesn't just unfold by itself. Taking a different intentional process towards complex systems that lead to an end result that is less fragile and rigid than what we may have had in the past. It's about finding the uncomfortable space and trying to identify what are the questions that aren't being asked. What aren't we reflecting on? What is important that we haven't yet identified or do not know, and how will we seek that out? We need to start with the end in mind, but to be open to possibilities. And we need to have the courage of our leadership to stay the course and not just to, when things get difficult, go back to, well, this is how we've always done it. And it wasn't terrible and it served us okay. Let's just go back to that. We need to resist that urge and stay the course and be intentional about our progress and where we want to end up. All right. Now we've got some time, hopefully left, about 8 or 10 minutes or so for some Q&A. I invite any questions from the participants and people joining us here. I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions that you might have. All right, there's a question there. How can educators prepare for an uncertain future? Look, and I think part of that's about changing our mindset a little bit about how we approach what we perceive as problems that might exist. I think the only thing that's, an often stated quote, the only thing that's certain is uncertainty, that things will change, things will adapt, the things that we won't see coming. And I think it's important that we instill a mindset of adaptability and flexibility in our peers and our colleagues and our students as well, as we move through the coming weeks and years. And I think if this past 12, 18 months has shown us is that the great capacity for schools and students and educators to be flexible, to adapt and to make things work, and many things that we have assumed in the past that we're too difficult or we can't do that because of X, Y, and Z, we've kind of been forced to over these past 12 or 18 months, and it's worked. And there's some amazing people that have done some wonderful things right around the world and shown that we can do it. And I think there's so many lessons for us to take on board for that. And I think a big part of that is the courage, to have the courage of our convictions and to see things through and be intentional as we move forward. But I think we've shown that we can do that this past 12 or 18 months, and we need to continue that mindset into the future. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And it's really, from what I've seen, it's about what we do at our school, and I've seen in many schools about the place, is about, you talked about there are forced disruptions. So it's about having the system in place to deal with anticipated or unanticipated disruptions. So it's really about how these groups work together when something comes along. Is it the one leader at the top who says, okay, we're going to do this? Or do you have a culture in your organization where you have a team of people that tackle a problem and get together and say, okay, do we clearly, if you follow the design thinking process, for example, and having that, for example, if your students are trained in and are using that as part of their work, if the teachers and educators and leaders are trained in that and use that as a part of their work. So when you meet with your teams, you say, the first step is empathizing. Say, do we really understand the problem here? What are we actually trying to solve? And really clearly define the problem. If that is a part of your culture in your organization that you have built up over time, then that is a really great approach to take in tackling a wide range of challenges and issues that exist in education, and that will come up from time to time. So it's not just something we teach our students in design thinking and STEM classes. We use it professionally in our teams to address the challenges that we have in getting the best solutions and outcomes for our whole learning community, not just our students. Okay, so look, thanks so much for joining us here today and discussing this topic. I've really enjoyed discussing this with you. Again, if you have any other further questions, comments, or reflections, I'd love to hear from you. Please reach out. Thank you so much for your time, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of the summer. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for sharing the insights. I am sure everybody is delighted to have you, and the insights are going to be helpful on a longer run. Thank you so much once again for being with us.